Right, speaking of nice people, now Lisa Parks, who's probably most of you know here, professor at what I'm now learning to call UC Santa Barbara, where she's the incoming chair of film and media studies. Lisa's going to talk for about 40 minutes, 50 minutes, something like that, maybe an hour. And then novelly, she's got some questions for you, which we'll sort of discuss in kind of this kind of forum. And then after that, we may break into smaller groups for some other work. Okay, thanks very much. I'll get out of your way.
Test, test. I might need to move it up a little closer. Okay. Well, thank you. First, I just want to say thanks again to the HRI staff because they have been working so hard to help facilitate this whole seminar, and thanks to Toby and Kate and David for their work in organizing the seminar, and most of all, thanks to all the participants for being here and taking these long hours each day to sit inside this room and listen and discuss issues related to creative industries and the humanities. My talk today is kind of broken into two parts, and I've called it Research Roots, and in some ways I'm taking advantage of the HRI's openness to experimental research and talks and investigations, and giving a kind of talk that I haven't really given before. The first part of the talk will focus on some art projects that I've been involved in the past several years. It's a way of kind of presenting a little bit about my research and thinking about this idea of art as research or action research, which Dick has really done a great job of developing and cultivating at UC Santa Barbara. So I'm going to spend the first part kind of going through some projects and talking about those issues. And then at the end, I'd like to kind of talk a little bit more about creative industries, raise some questions about the way creative industries has been conceptualized, and how the films that we looked at may allow us to complicate some of the ways in which that formulation has been brought forth by Florida, and then the way that people are taking it up and thinking about it, where in some of the formulations, the artist kind of becomes a cog in the wheel of neoliberalism, and I really want to complicate that assumption. So I'll be moving toward that at the end of the talk. The image that you see here, in a way, I'm starting with an image that represents a project that I dream of and fantasize about working on, and a place that I hope to go to within the next year. This is a photograph of a fallen satellite. It's Cosmos 954. It's a Soviet satellite that fell into the Northwest Territories in northern Canada in 1978, and I'm currently developing a project where I'm looking at this fallen satellite in relation to the interception by the U.S. military of US 193 earlier this year, and trying to do a site-specific investigation of these, this crash and this interception that will culminate in an art collaboration as well. So I start with this as a place where I hope to go, but I will not be talking about this other than just to start here with this image. And I hope eventually to develop a concept that I'm trying to think of dandelion capitalism, where satellites accumulate. As they accumulate, they can be destroyed as quickly as a dandelion blows away in midair. It's a different kind of high capital, intensive accumulation that as fast as it's launched and mobilized into orbit, it can be destroyed. And I think I'm interested in thinking through this and investigating these sites. So I start with that just as a sense of, to give you a sense of the way that I try to project and think forward while I'm still working on things in the present. And if any of you have seen Ice Road Truckers, any Ice Road Trucker fans in the house? It's a TV show set in Yellowknife, Canada, way up there, about these big long-haul trucks that almost fall through the ice as they're delivering goods to remote territories. That's where that is set. Okay. So I'm not a Dick Hebdige or a Toby Miller or a George Udice or an Andrew Ross or a Kate Oakley. So I thought I would start just with a little bit of background about me, since I'm relatively junior in relation to some of the other participants and leaders of the seminar. My first book, Cultures in Orbit, explores how satellites are cultural technologies that are implicated in particular ways of seeing and knowing the world. And in that book, I critically examined specific practices, specific and very specifically situated practices of live transmission, direct broadcasting, remote sensing, and astronomical observation. And these practices, I try to suggest in that book, help to redefine or reconfigure what we think of as the televisual and the global. And I'm kind of, complicating the kind of Western Eurocentric imaginaries that have been implicit within particular uses of satellite technologies. Out of that book out of that project have emerged two new book projects that I'm working on. And I want to mention this and give you kind of nutshell summaries of these two books that I'm trying to work on right now, because as I've been working on them for the past 4 or 5 years, I've also been really involved in art projects that are directly related to the publication of these books. And so I'm trying to kind of sketch out an idea about, thinking through the relationship between creative labor and cognitive labor, or academic labor, whatever we want to call it. And I'm trying to navigate my way through these categories myself. So the first new book that I'm working on is called Coverage. And the book uses the term coverage, and I use this term coverage as a rubric in which to investigate the changing relationships between media, space, and security after 9/11. I argue that the meaning of coverage needs to be reassessed in the context of digitization, convergence, and heightened security. And I engage with a variety of media discourses, including commercial television news broadcasts, international press reports, satellite and aerial imagery, PowerPoint presentations like Colin Powell's presentation to the UN Security Council, for example, Google Earth layers, airport security scans, and viral videos. So I'm trying to think about the new kind of literally new kind of forms of media coverage that are emerging. But I also use this array of media to extend the media meaning of coverage beyond the mere act of news reporting, and to account for the multifarious ways in which media technologies are being used to produce knowledge and secure space. And so the book is organized as a series of site-specific investigations where I set out to expand the definition of coverage to refer to the provision and exclusion of information. So coverage isn't just to provide information, it often involves covering up, covering over, and concealing. The second issue I really explore is the increasing production and distribution of high-resolution aerial and orbital images of the Earth as a new kind of vision of coverage. And then the third issue I'm exploring in that book is the intensification of surveillance practices. I mean, building on the work of people like David Lyon and Mark Andreevich, whose new book, I Spy, I don't know if you've read it, is really interesting. But thinking about the intensification of surveillance practices across media platforms and institutional and geophysical locations. So that's one project I'm working on. The second one, and this one is more relevant to some of the work that you're going to see in a few minutes, is called Mixed Signals. And this work emerges out of my Cultures in Orbit book in the sense that I'm trying to think through what satellite footprints are and how we can go about developing a critical model for analyzing satellite and now wireless footprints, these zones of signal circulation that where wireless and satellite corporations are territorializing themselves across particular parts of the planet. So this second book, Mixed Signals, and it's quite different from the first one, you'll see, investigates the emergence of satellite and wireless systems in 3 different sites on the outskirts of Europe, the former Yugoslavia, Mongolia, and Turkey. And the project considers how the implementation of wireless and satellite systems during the past 20 years relates to various transnational political, economic, and cultural campaigns after the fall of socialism and communism and in the midst of the expansion of the EU. And by examining former Yugoslavia, a socialist state that underwent a major civil war and political restructuring during the 1990s, Mongolia, a former protectorate of the Soviet Union that declared its independence in the 90s, and Turkey, a secular Islamic country on the verge of joining the EU, I set out to delineate the media infrastructures of so-called societies in transition and explore how they're implicated within U.S. and Western European geoeconomic strategies, political alliances, and cultural campaigns that are being articulated on the thresholds of Southeastern Europe, Eurasia, and the Middle East. So these three sites are very specifically selected because of their geographic position in part. So in the midst of working on these research projects, these books that I hope will become publications, I've been collaborating very actively with artists, and this collaboration has been instrumental in thinking through how to conduct the research for these two projects. And so before getting into that and getting into some of these examples, I want to kind of raise two general questions that have been kind of getting at me. And these are kind of very general questions, but I want to ask, what is the relationship between cognitive, creative, and manual labor, and how do they overlap? I mean, I'm going to try to show some images that suggest that they do overlap. And can engagement with creative workers help to make academic work more experimental? And, we talk about interdisciplinarity in the humanities a lot. But as Dick suggested earlier today, often the arts gets sort of tagged on at the end of the sentence. It's like the way that humanities gets tagged on at the end of the sentence sometimes in UC science discussions. So I take this question really seriously and materially. I really want to substantially engage with this. And then second, what are the major research questions and methodologies for creative industry studies? How would they differ from or relate to those of cultural and media studies? And I mean, when I ask this, I'm thinking in my own head about, how can we move from a situation like Adorno and Horkheimer's recognition of the culture industries and the nomination of a culture industries. We move from that, on the one hand, to the formation of cultural studies. Stuart Hall, Raymond Williams, and others, the identification of a field called cultural studies. So is there something, what is going to happen with this term creative industries or creative industry studies? And what is the relationship between this and pre-existing academic work? Is there a need, as Rick mentioned the other day, to kind of retrain ourselves? And I think in some sense there is. Across certain disciplines, like, we need to, some of us will choose to read more policy, and make more policy interventions. Other people may see this as an opportunity to engage more immediately and directly with the arts. So maybe this collision of cultural studies and creative industry studies will encourage those of us who are still sort of entrenched somehow in cultural studies to make a move not just to study popular culture and mass culture, but also to rethink the relationship between cultural studies and what sometimes get called, fine arts or contemporary art. Then the third thing that seems like these questions are also leading to, and this has come up, I think one was the first to really bring these really important issues up the other day, and of course the organizers have these issues at heart as well, but globalizing the field of inquiry further and really dealing with differences of scale, location, history, class, structure. The idea that the word creativity means different things in different languages and in different historical moments. That property and work also have radically different meanings across different contexts. So I'm not so much a theorist then of creative industries. I'm an academic that engages in creative practices, that tries to engage in creative practices, and that I've had some opportunities to work with artists. And as I've said already, participating in these kinds of collaborations has substantially changed my research practices and the way that I think about what conducting research means and the forms that it might take in the end and the places in which it circulates and gets presented and the communities that might engage with it. So that, to me, the coming into contact and into collaboration with artists has it pushed me and challenged me to radically rethink what I'm trying to do. So I want to go through then and just talk about a few of the projects that I've been involved in. As I was finishing in Cultures in Orbit, I had an opportunity to go to a collaboratory called the Macro Lab, which was developed by a Slovenian artist who is also an art professor at UC Santa Barbara and who also will become the new co-director of the UC IRA. A project, it's an architecture and performance art project called Macro Lab. It's a migrating lab that he invented in 1997 that moves to a different location every 2 years, usually a remote location away from urban space, and takes advantage of communication networks and infrastructure to allow artists to kind of cocoon in and insulate themselves and work intensively in these remote environments for various lengths of residency. And I collaborated in 2002. Ursula Beeman and I ended up doing a project when the Macro Lab was in Scotland. A lot of other artists were there as well, called Experiments in Satellite Media Arts. And so as I was finishing Cultures in Orbit, I was also trying to think about, there's a lot of people who might not ever read this book. Or is there a form that I can use to try to help develop a project related to the literacy about satellites? What do satellites do? Well, one of the things that we did there was we downlinked we had access to all kinds of satellite television signals from all over the world. So we just downlinked and made archives of satellite TV signals. And then we wanted to experiment with some kind of aesthetic practice that would try to layer multiple signals that were falling into the same footprint within the same frame. I mean, this becomes really difficult when you don't have huge amounts of memory, and video editing is quite a bit challenging. But this is just a still from, instead of channel surfing, we were trying to channel layer within the same frame and develop a composite of the complexity of signals that are falling into the same territory and that could potentially be caught, captured, and watched at the same time. So that's one of the issues we were investigating in our project Experiments in Satellite Media Arts. Another thing we were doing is, at this time, the war in Afghanistan, of course, was going on. So we were thinking about satellite espionage and gathering a lot of declassified satellite images of destruction in Afghanistan, and we made a series of short videos that then kind of became this little package. We also were thinking about orbital debris, gathering images and thinking about the space around the Earth as a waste site, as even a hazardous waste site if you think about this issue over time, and trying to investigate the particular objects that are in circulation in orbit. It's not just dead and decaying satellites, or it's things like astronauts' gloves that got lost in the midst of a repair mission out in space. And so we had one video that kind of tries to look at all of the objects that are polluting the periphery of the Earth. We also tried to engage with satellite workers. So we made a visit to the Dundee satellite tracking station, which was nearby, about 2 hours away from where we were, and interviewed them and tried to get a sense of the daily rhythms of their work and what satellite tracking work is like. So this also got folded into our project. When we think about creative industries, usually we're thinking about urban spaces and major transformations of urban spaces and cosmopolitanism. But the Macro Lab allows people to do art where you're insulated inside and you go out and the things you have around you are things like this. So and all of our power was solar and wind power. So it's like making art in electronic media art, where if the sun isn't shining or the wind's not blowing, you've got to do something else. It became a kind of interesting experiment in realizing the relationship between artistic practice and natural resources or the natural environment. It's not, just about software or something. Another project that I've worked on was in 2003. I had an opportunity to go to a village called Rajan in Croatia, and I had been doing some research for Chapter 3 of Cultures in Orbit, where I had gone on a research trip to Srebrenica in Bosnia and ended up spending quite a bit of time in Bosnia, Croatia, and Slovenia, and was invited to come back after giving a couple of talks and work on a collaborative project called Loom, where we met with, this was a project I did with a Slovenian artist called Miha Vipotnik. Some of you probably know him. We worked with some Croatian students and German students to try to figure out a way to repurpose a satellite that had been used by the military during the war. There were satellites like this that were basically used to send, transmit messages back and forth during the war in Yugoslavia. What we ended up doing is getting a friend, another collaborator was named Ivo Dekovic. And Ivo had a friend who worked for the Postal Service who said there was one laying in the backyard of the post office. So we grabbed one of these. This is the manual labor of creative work, where it involved welding and wrestling and all kinds of other work. This is Ivo kind of assembling the satellite so that we could actually install it underwater. What we wanted to do is repurpose this satellite dish that had been used to transmit messages during the war and repurpose it kind of literally as a vessel or a kind of carrier system that emulated some of the historical rituals that had taken place along this coast, where people had taken and deposited tokens and objects to gods in hope for better weather, better future, and so on and so forth. So we took this satellite, I'll come back to this in a second, and put it underwater. And we invited members of the nearby village to bring objects that somehow carried the burdens and the fresh memories of the recent war, and to deposit them within the dish. In the center of the dish, we placed a small webcam so we could actually record the people coming down into the dish and their face as they're dropping the object in. And all kinds of different objects. Let me just read you. This is part of the text that we used to present. So we invited the people to come in and deposit personal objects into a satellite dish that had been used by the Croatian government to relay messages during the war. In a matter of years, this dish, along with many crumbled homes, still this area was in ruins, along Croatia's transit corridors had become the ruins of our time. Yet when anchored in the murky depths of the Adriatic, the pale gray dish took on another life. It became the locus of a strange system of submarine signaling and exchange, as divers plunged one after another into its center to deliver belongings that carried the weight of historical experience, still too fresh to comprehend. So memory-bearing objects such as a metal token, a plastic toy giraffe, a hammer, a car engine starter, a book manuscript, and a pack of cigarettes bounced off and mingled together in the sea. I'm just showing you a few of these. What we ended up doing is people would do a dive and then they'd drop something, and then this is a pair of boxing gloves, and you can see there we had an image, a camera right in that hole in the center of the dish. Then we interviewed everybody and created a kind of archive of objects and stories, and the students were full collaborators in this project as well. We ended up presenting, it had a kind of, there was a kind of time-based event factor to it. It was a performance, but it also had, we presented it at a gallery in Los Angeles called the Post Gallery, and the most interesting thing about the project was that just the announcement of the region of our project brought all these immigrants and displaced people who had come to LA after the war in Yugoslavia to this exhibition. And so when we had like about a 10-minute video, and we put it in an old ice chest and had the visitor had to kind of look down into this hole and read the interviews. A lot of these people that you see standing were people from the former Yugoslavia who wanted to come and who engaged and were really interested that something like this would be done in order to try to process the war. Okay, I want to talk about two more projects before moving on to the second part. And I'll try to talk about these kind of quickly. This one, this was a media installation, but it's also a research publication, and you have the PDF file. I think it's in a version that's first in Spanish and the second part's in English. So this research, post-war footprints, will end up becoming part of my book, Mixed Signals. But it's rooted in a 3-year collaboration with European media artists, and Angela calls herself a theorist too. So Ursula Beeman and Angela Melatopoulos. And our research collaboration was a 3-year thing called Transcultural Geographies. And the project set out to critically investigate highway, oil, and telecommunication infrastructures in relation to the current expansion and redefinition of Europe. Our grant contract with the German Ministry of Culture required us to experiment with visual research methods and to collaborate in a way that would culminate in a major art exhibition in Europe. And so my contribution to this was called Post-War Footprints, and the research involved, a lot of trips to the region, interviews, and gathering of all kinds of materials, the shooting of a lot of photographs myself, and it has taken, different forms. As I talk through this, I'm just going to show you some of the kinds of materials that I was interested in. But this idea that this, as a representation of an infrastructure, is totally insufficient. I mean, this is my whole starting point, where this tells us nothing about infrastructure stories, histories, the things that happen around and in relation to infrastructures. And so what I was interested in finding out is how, in the midst of the war in Yugoslavia, the U.S. and NATO was directly involved in eradicating this socialist broadcast infrastructure, and convening on towers and destroying them, and documenting their destruction of these sites. And so I gathered a lot of material destroying the infrastructures, the socialist broadcast telecom infrastructures, and then the question became, what has replaced it? And I try to document the replacement of the socialist system. I mean, it's not a surprise, right, that Western media cartels are the beneficiaries of the destruction of the Yugoslav broadcast and telecom system. And so I detail this in quite a bit of depth in the Post-War Footprints chapter you have, although I think that's a short version of the chapter. I like this. This is the former Radio TV Serbia, or Yugoslavia, now Radio TV Serbia, site, and it's like these two people kind of lovingly walking by in the ruins of communication. There's something interesting about this image to me. So in the midst of collaborating with Ursula and Angela, we did a research design where we would have to meet at least 2 or 3 times a year in the sites of our research, which meant that I had to go where Ursula was doing her work, Angela, as well as Angela's, and they had to come to mine. And we had to organize sessions where we would present work in progress and also invite local members of the community, whether artists or curators or academics, to our research sessions. So the design of it was really transnational in its ambitions, in the sense that we were moving around to different locations and really thinking relationally about the spaces in which we were researching, the infrastructures that we were investigating, and so on and so forth. So I put this in, again, as a reminder of how manual creative labor is. This is what this installation looked like before, when people were working quite hard on arranging the space, and this is what it looks like afterward, where I did 2 PowerPoint presentations projected on those 2 screens that basically rearranged and represented and tried to rematerialize a lot of the visual stuff that I had gathered and shot myself. And then what you see on the floor are the satellite and wireless footprints that have taken over the region since the destruction of the infrastructure. On the wall on the other side, I worked with a cartographer to develop a map showing that the satellite owners and operators are also the profiteers in the new post-Yugoslav media economy. Because instead of selling time to one national public broadcaster, now there are about 22 private broadcasters in the region buying time on, I can't remember, I think it's 15 different satellites. So there's what looks on the surface to be a pluralization of the media economy in the former Yugoslavia, but it's also related to this new satellite economy as well. And I think it's worth thinking about this in relation to creative industries and the idea that creative industries are built, in some cases, on the fresh ruins of war. They don't emerge out of nowhere. And I'm going to come back to this point later, that actually infrastructures are part of the precondition, like new infrastructures, high-speed telecommunication and satellite infrastructures are part of the precondition for the emergence of the so-called creative industries, in that they're predicated on digital, speedy forms of creative work. So I think to jump into this idea of immaterial labor without looking at, in very meticulous ways, at what are these industries built upon, literally in terms of the hardware and the wires and the cables and the pipelines and the satellites that support them. That's something that I'm very much interested in. So this last project that I'll talk about, and this is a frame from another media, it's the opening frame from another media installation that I did, and this one is about looking at wireless infrastructure in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. I'm going to talk much more about this tomorrow afternoon. I'll do a research presentation where I show you a lot of this. But the model for this project really, and this is the model that I'm working on not only in this installation form, but trying to elaborate in the book Mixed Signals. I'm trying to develop a critical practice or method called footprint analysis, where I begin with these cartographies, these maps of wireless and satellite corporations, and then try to move through specific sites within those maps in order to investigate their claims to territory and space, and to look at the variations and differences across these footprints. So these maps are highly reductive and insufficient in terms of enabling us to understand the material dimensions of infrastructures. So roaming is a footprint analysis where I start with Mobicom, one of the wireless service providers' footprints, and then move through these territories and try to give them some kind of dimensionality and make them more vivid in a sense, or make them more embodied. So in this installation, I cycle through different shots of Google Earth, Google Earth and wireless footprints, and then I alternate between these workers, and I'll tell the whole story tomorrow, but in a nutshell, these are workers who, many of whom were displaced in the transition from communism to this moment of, liberalization in Mongolia, which is happening slowly. And many of them migrated to Ulaanbaatar and were displaced economically, had been tractor drivers on a farm or restaurant owners in a rural community. And mobile phone work became something that was quite amenable to people who didn't need to be retrained. So these mobile phones are carried around the city by these workers, And they're masters of the rhythms of urban life in Ulaanbaatar. They know where to be at what time, and they move around to sell time on phones. I know this practice is also happening in other parts of the world. I know in Egypt, for instance, and I believe in Morocco as well. But this is a different model of mobile telephony. It's not one of private mobilization or mobile privatization. It's a kind of transitional model of collective access and ownership where not everybody can afford to have a cell phone with dead time in the pocket. And so all kinds of people of all different ages are moving around the city and selling time. And I'll talk about this more tomorrow. But this is another project that I presented it's a research project, but it's an art project, and doing it as an art project helps me to think through it as a research project and figure out how it should be written, how it should be investigated, what things I haven't thought about. This was at the Transmedial exhibition in Berlin earlier this year. And what I tried to do in this was, situate the visitor at the technological and financial interface of Mongolian white phone workers. And so I offered a series of photographs of different phone workers with different stands offering time for sale. And the visitor is positioned in front of the projection screen as if he or she is about to purchase a call. While standing at the interface, the visitor is encouraged to recognize a form of public mobile telephony. And then city maps of Ulaanbaatar are projected onto the floor along with footprints of wireless corporations that operate in the city. And so the piece is designed to simulate and stage an act of roaming, wireless use in another country. But rather than being charged additional fees, the visitor will learn about a different configuration of mobile telephony. The installation is intended to emphasize technological variation in the context of globalization, the figurative relocations that occur through transnational infrastructures, and the dialectics of distance and proximity that shape wireless encounters. And I'll talk about that more tomorrow because a lot of them are wearing these masks, and you probably have questions about that. But I'll go on. So in a nutshell, then, summing up these works, then, these projects involve researching, in general terms, uses and emergences of satellite and wireless systems, which are often obscure or imperceptible. I mean, a lot of people never see satellites with their own eyes unless you look up at night to try to witness one. And then finding ways of making these obscure, imperceptible technologies and dispersed infrastructures or systems material, treating them as sites of research and creative experimentation. The projects also involve, and these are things that I think, may relate to some of the things that have come up about, like, what is the interface between academics and creative industries. I mean, definitely involve all kinds of acts of translation, community engagement, experimentation with research materials and forms, interdisciplinary frameworks, lots of huge arguments and conflicts and tensions, really meltdowns, sometimes time, sustaining the challenge of sustaining transnational collaborations. When you've worked on these projects with people, there's something really melancholic about them ending, and trying to want to find ways to revive and redirect the energies that come out of these kinds of projects in new directions. And then as somebody within the UC system, I just feel very important that it's incumbent upon us to be really aggressive about outreaching UC humanities research. So finding ways of presenting our work, yes, in book and article form, but in the age of digitization, we have other opportunities as well. And so for me, it's been a real exciting challenge to try to find. I'm not necessarily satisfied with the art forms that I've created. When I put this together, I thought, wow, everything is much more neat in the gallery than it should be. It should be really messy. It looks too orderly and framed, and I got to work on that. So just to wrap this up then, and try to move into the second part where it's more about conversation and you guys talking, I think. I just think it's important when we're talking about creative industries, and I'm thinking about infrastructures in particular in relation to creative industries. I found this quote on one of Richard Florida's websites the other day, where it's a creative class website, and this is a post from just recently where, I don't know if I'll read the whole thing, but well, maybe I will. The great intensification, which is the concentration of energy necessary to formulate creative industries, creative cities, requires new infrastructure. He says, my hunch is the regions to move first to develop this kind of broad connective fiber will gain considerable competitive advantage, not just in energy use, but in terms of time cost and the development of new technologies and industries. Remember, the rise of the highway system and suburban infrastructure was always more than transportation and real estate development. It simultaneously provides an enormous spur to the emerging industries of the day, from autos to all sorts of consumer durables, blah, blah, blah. So getting the infrastructure of the mega region right will not only improve our connectivity and save energy, it will fuel the development of new markets, new technology, and new jobs. And for me, somebody who's thinking about these footprints, these wireless and satellite footprints, the re-territorialization of regions as these transnational marketplaces. Footprints are trade routes. I mean, there's a great article by Monroe Price called, talking about satellites as making trade routes in the skies. I think it's important to think about the way these mega regions are contingent upon the use of satellite and wireless infrastructures. And I know I haven't talked about internet infrastructure, but sometimes it hinges on the backbones of these systems now. I mean, just describing these infrastructures is a challenge, at least for me as a humanities scholar. So I look at this, and then I take it and set it aside something like this, because this is the work that has first influenced me in thinking about infrastructure, the work of kind of critical urban planning scholars like Simon Marvin and Stephen Graham, working out of the UK, with their I think, really interesting, books, Splintering Urbanism. Infrastructure networks and the socio-technical processes that surround them are strongly involved in structuring and delineating the experiences of urban culture in what Raymond Williams termed the structures of feeling of modern urban life. As capital that is literally sunk and embedded within and between the fabrics of cities, infrastructure networks represent long-term accumulations of finance, technology, know-how, organizational, and geopolitical power. I just took a quote out of their book, but their study is much more of a kind of analysis of structural conditions, issues of inequality and difference, relational forms of thinking across different infrastructure systems. So thinking across water and telecommunication and energy. And what are the kind of industrial relations that form across these sectors, and where these infrastructures are in some sense layered upon and contingent upon one another. I'm interested in these issues, and in fact I just started writing an essay about oil, in some ways inspired by Ursula Beeman's work, oil pipelines and satellite television services. Because the oil pipeline, and I'm focusing on Kazakhstan, where the oil pipelines that are being built in Kazakhstan are also subsidizing satellites. That revenue, Kazakhstan is one of the only post-communist countries to own its own satellites. Why? It has enormous oil wealth, and it owns the Cosmodrome, the former Soviet launch facility. So there's something specific about the use of infrastructure to create a new mega region where 10, 20 years down the line we might be able to talk about so-called creative industries that are emerging in this part of Central Asia. Okay, let's see now. How should we do it now? I just could say jump in a new direction for a few minutes, and then we can break into groups if you guys want to do that. Maybe we should do that. Just a few things then. Let me go back to my notes. So then it's kind of like the so what question in some ways. And where I want to go with it, it's kind of, you could say, okay, great, isn't it wonderful that academics have had the opportunities to travel and make artworks and then present them neatly in these little galleries. And don't think that I don't think about that, and I'm unaware of that. I think about it all the time, and it's a really important issue, I think. And what I want to do is mention, just briefly, I want to invoke this article by a Danish writer called Stefan Johnson that was published in Lettres Internationales in the fall of 2006. And in this article, Johnson suggests that the Western-dominated international news agencies, he makes this really great and important argument, have proven to be incapable of researching and representing cultural differences. And over time, they've shown their increasing unwillingness to explore cultural differences and represent them. And after making this argument, Johnson goes on to say that really what this means is that Western journalism has failed at representing the complexity of globalization. And of course, I mean, that might not be a huge surprise to us, right? It's a hard thing to investigate, to put into language, to visualize, or to present as a sonic experience. But what Johnson suggests is that artists, contemporary artists, and contemporary filmmakers, especially experimental filmmakers, have filled in the gap. So what's happening is we have a situation in the world where we have major media conglomeration happening, where funding for investigative journalism and reporting has dwindled to a pathetic trickle, combined with the idea that many journalists may not even be adequately trained to investigate cultural differences in the world and the complexity of globalization. So what this means is that there is a need for new research forms and new kinds of investigative practices. And that's one of the reasons that I showed you all the films by Ursula Beeman and David Redman, the Black Sea Files and the Mardi Gras Made in China, because it seems to me this kind of work by art and filmmakers is trying to do the job of making globalization vivid in some way, making it intelligible, giving us something substantive and meaningful to engage with critically. And so in each of these projects, we see, and I was going to show you one more called Bombay Calling. I'm sorry you didn't get to see that one, but you have Beeman and Redman as members of the so-called creative class, right? Setting out to investigate labor conditions in relation to forces of globalization in different parts of the world. Labor conditions as well as infrastructural developments in the case of Beeman. And so my question, I mean, I have a list of questions here if you guys want to get in groups and deal with these questions, or there's an exercise that we could do too. The question really is, what happens when members of the creative class aren't, they set out to expose the exploitative sides of globalization, and is there a place for such critical arts research within the existing definitions of creative industries? This has kind of already come up already, and Dick definitely got at this in his talk earlier. But by offering these accounts of globalization processes, these kind of artworks and this kind of art research, this help to complicate terms such as creative class, creative cities, and creative industries, and challenge us to consider differences as these concepts are mobilized across transnational contexts and in relation to various economic sectors. And as I said at the beginning, call me a romantic with respect to the position of the artist as a kind of, not hero, but certainly playing a crucial role when we've got media conglomeration and creating a kind of meltdown for knowledge. We need contemporary artists more than ever who are willing to investigate what's going on, what the hell is going on this planet, when our news agencies aren't doing justice at that job. So I guess in relation to this then, just to end with 3 points, and then we can break out into the groups and talk about all this if you feel like it. I just want to, maybe these points are a little bit redundant to what I've already said and somehow obvious, but I'll just close with these 3 points then. So creative industries, and thinking about this, I think they're relational and cross-sector formations that are material. I appreciate the definition of immaterial labor, but I still feel creative industries, we need to define their materiality and materialism, so that we have, what is the relationship between creative industries and other sectors of the economy? Think about these 3 examples. Pharmaceuticals now fuel the U.S. commercial TV industry, especially the cable news networks. So we've got a relationship between the creative industries, the writers for television. Their work is predicated on the sale of pharmaceuticals, the manufacturing and the sale, the deregulation of the pharmaceutical industry. So we need to think about creative industries in terms of these cross-sector relational formations. Oil development, as I already insinuated, when you've got an area where oil exploration and extraction is happening, there's going to be satellites following. A lot of oil rigs are kept into place by satellite remote control systems. And these whole regions are monitored and facilitated by satellite communication. So oil and satellite television and industries are relational, and internet as well. Military weapons systems, manufacturing, this manufacturing sector is related to computer games, the invention, creation of computer games. So I'm not saying this is a new concept. I just think in doing the research, encouraging this kind of relational cross-sector thinking when trying to define what creative industries are. And then the second issue, which I already mentioned, needing to contextualize creative industries concept in different sites and in relation to different political and economic conditions. And I've been really interested in post-communist conditions, where we also have different versions of neoliberalism within post-communist conditions. Neoliberalism gets radically accelerated in this crude way, where everything from healthcare to the payment of artists is privatized overnight, creating huge chaos for people who were socialized into the world to think about with a particular disposition to the state that then has outsourced all of its obligations to these Western-owned private corporations. I mean, imagine this not only in terms of a political, economic condition to describe, but as a psychic condition as well. And then the final point, which I've also just already mentioned, but just to reinforce, the idea of infrastructural reform and development as a precondition for the emergence of creative industries. They don't just pop up. It involves radical rethinking of space, of kind of wide mega regions, as Florida is calling them, and how infrastructures connect and intersect these areas. So I think I'll stop there, and what I was thinking we could do is just get into groups, and I have a list of questions that are in some ways triggered by the 2 films. And then the other thing I was thinking, some people have come up and said, we should do some kind of creative project, and it might be possible in your group to create something, to conceptualize a creative project that exposes something about creativity, globalization, and class structure, for example, or come up with your own thing that you would want to do. But so I have these pieces of paper that have some questions, and then the last thing is that last option. So